The brass instruments gleamed cold under the oil lamp's amber glow as Dr. Margaret Whitmore adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and approached the examination table. Samuel Hartwell lay motionless, his 16-year-old frame draped in a thin cotton sheet that did little to conceal the unnaturally symmetrical curves beneath. His breathing came in shallow, measured intervals, and his pale green eyes tracked her movements with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Samuel, I need you to remain perfectly still while I conduct this examination," she said, her voice maintaining the professional tone that had served her well in the 3 years since becoming Centralia's first female physician. "Your mother has described some unusual developments." The boy's lips curved into what might have been a smile. "She's frightened of me, doctor. But then again, so are you." Dr. Whitmore paused, her leather journal halfway open. Samuel's voice carried an odd quality, not quite the cracking uncertainty of adolescence, but something deeper, more knowing. She had examined hundreds of patients since establishing her practice, yet none had ever made her feel as though she were the one being studied. "I'm here to help," she replied, though her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her stethoscope. "Now, please describe when you first noticed these changes your mother mentioned." Samuel's eyes drifted toward the ceiling, where shadows danced in the lamplight. "It started with dreams that weren't mine. Memories of places I'd never been, people I'd never met. Then my body began, responding to these dreams. Reshaping itself to accommodate what was trying to get in." As she placed the cold metal disc against his chest, Dr. Whitmore felt a jolt run through her fingertips. His heartbeat was wrong, not irregular, but somehow doubled, as if two separate rhythms were attempting to synchronize. She pulled back instinctively, but Samuel's hand shot up and grasped her wrist. "You felt it too, didn't you?" His grip was firm but not painful, his skin unnaturally warm. "The connection. It's already starting." Before she could respond, images flooded her mind, flashes of darkness, the taste of cold dust, the weight of earth pressing down from above. She saw men with blackened faces screaming names she didn't recognize, their voices echoing in spaces that couldn't exist beneath the small mining town of Centralia. She jerked her hand free, stumbling backward until her spine pressed against the examination room wall. What was that?" Samuel sat up slowly, the sheet falling away to reveal the source of his mother's terror. His torso bore characteristics of both sexes, but arranged in patterns that defied medical understanding. The formation seemed almost deliberate, as if shaped by some intelligence rather than the random mutations she had studied in her medical texts. "The first time it happened to me, I thought I was dying," he said, his voice now carrying a subtle accent she couldn't place. "But death would have been simpler. What's happening to me, what's happening to us now, it's more like birth. Something ancient is being born through me." Dr. Whitmore forced herself to approach the table again, her scientific training warring with every instinct screaming at her to flee. She needed to document what she was seeing, to find some rational explanation that could be recorded in proper medical terminology. Her pen scratched across the journal's pages as she noted the unprecedented anatomical features, but the words seemed inadequate to capture the true horror of Samuel's condition. "Tell me about your family history," she managed, focusing on the familiar rhythm of clinical inquiry. "Any hereditary conditions, unusual births, complications during your mother's pregnancy?" Samuel's laugh was hollow, echoing strangely in the small room. "My family has lived above the old mine shafts for 3 generations, doctor. We've breathed the earth's exhalations our entire lives. Whatever's down there has been patient, waiting for the right vessel." As he spoke, Dr. Whitmore noticed her own reflection in the darkened window beginning to shift and blur. For a moment, she saw herself with different eyes, older, wearing clothes from decades past, her hair arranged in a style she'd never worn. The woman in the reflection mouthed words that weren't hers, "The boy is the door." "You see her too," Samuel observed, following her gaze. "Dr. Eleanor Blackwood." She was Centralia's physician before the first mine collapse in 1854. She documented cases similar to mine, though she called them spiritual afflictions rather than medical conditions. The reflection smiled, a cold, knowing expression that belonged neither to Dr. Whitmore nor the woman she was seeing. Then the glass returned to normal, showing only her own pale, frightened face. "This is impossible," she whispered, though she continued writing in her journal with mechanical precision. "There must be a rational explanation. Hormonal imbalances, perhaps, or some form of psychological manifestation affecting my perception." Samuel swung his legs over the side of the examination table, and Dr. Whitmore noticed that his shadow fell in multiple directions despite the single light source. "Science has its limitations, Doctor. Some conditions can't be diagnosed with instruments and measurements. Some things require a different kind of understanding." The temperature in the room began to drop, their breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The lamp flame flickered, casting writhing shadows that seemed to move independently of any physical obstruction. Dr. Whitmore heard voices, distant at first, then growing closer. Men's voices, calling out in desperation from somewhere far below. "They're the ones who came before me," Samuel explained, as if reading her thoughts. "Miners who dug too deep, who found spaces that were never meant to be found. Their bodies died, but their essence, that found its way into the bloodline of those who lived above them." Dr. Whitmore's journal slipped from her numb fingers, pages scattering across the floor. Each sheet now bore writing that wasn't hers, detailed medical observations in a spidery hand, describing cases of men and women who had gradually lost their individual identities to something that lived in the deep places of the earth. "The examination is complete, Doctor," Samuel said, standing and reaching for his clothes. His movements were graceful, almost feminine, but his voice now carried the authority of someone much older. "Though I suspect you understand now that I'm not the patient in this room. We both are." As he dressed, Dr. Whitmore found herself unable to move, transfixed by the realization that her carefully ordered world of medical science had crumbled in the space of 30 minutes. The boy, or whatever Samuel was becoming, straightened his collar and regarded her with something that might have been pity. "I'll return tomorrow evening," he said. "Not by choice, you understand, but because the connection between us is now established. What you've seen tonight is only the beginning." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the brass knob. "Oh, and Doctor, you might want to avoid sleeping tonight. The dreams that come after the first contact tend to be educational." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Dr. Whitmore alone with the scattered pages of her journal and the growing certainty that she had just documented the beginning of her own transformation. Have you ever felt like someone else was living inside your own body? The next morning brought no relief from the previous night's horrors. Dr. Whitmore sat behind her desk, staring at the journal pages she had attempted to reorganize, when a hesitant knock interrupted her brooding. Mrs. Hartwell entered without waiting for permission, her face drawn and haggard, clutching a worn leather satchel against her chest. "Doctor, please," the woman began, settling into the chair across from the desk. "I know what you saw last night. I know what Samuel showed you." Dr. Whitmore looked up from her notes, studying the woman's prematurely aged features. Elizabeth Hartwell couldn't have been more than 40, yet her brown hair was streaked with premature silver, and her hands shook with the tremor of someone who had endured prolonged terror. "Mrs. Hartwell, your son's condition is unlike anything I've encountered in my medical training," Dr. Whitmore said carefully. "I'll need to conduct additional examinations, perhaps consult with colleagues in Philadelphia." "No." The word came out sharp, desperate. "No one else can know about Samuel. You don't understand what this town would do if they discovered the truth about our family." Mrs. Hartwell opened the leather satchel with reverent care, withdrawing a collection of yellowed papers, daguerreotypes, and what appeared to be medical documents dating back decades. She spread them across the desk like a grim offering. The changes began 3 years ago, just after Samuel's 13th birthday, she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. At first, I thought it was normal, boys his age often experience confusing developments. But then the voices started. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward, examining a faded photograph of a man in mining clothes. The resemblance to Samuel was unmistakable, though the image appeared to be from the 1850s. "That's my grandfather, Thomas Hartwell," Mrs. Hartwell explained. "He died in the mine collapse of 1854, along with 17 other men. They were trapped in a section that had been deliberately sealed by the mining company years earlier. The official report said they suffocated, but the survivors who helped dig them out, they told different stories." She pulled out a newspaper clipping, the headline barely legible, "Centralia miners exhibit strange behavior before rescue attempt." "The men who went down to recover the bodies came back changed," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "They spoke of finding the trapped miners still alive after 3 weeks underground, but not themselves anymore. The rescued men claimed to remember things from before they were born, knew intimate details about families they'd never met, spoke in voices that belonged to the dead." Dr. Whitmore picked up a medical document written in the same spidery handwriting she had seen in her journal the night before. The signature at the bottom read, "Drive E. Blackwood." "Samuel wasn't the first," Mrs. Hartwell said, noticing her focus on the document. "Dr. Blackwood documented 6 cases between 1854 and 1862, all descendants of men who died in that sealed section of the mine. The condition seemed to skip generations, manifesting in children who reached adolescence in houses built above the old shafts. The medical report detailed symptoms that matched Samuel's perfectly, gradual physical changes that defied classification, the manifestation of multiple personalities corresponding to the dead miners, and an increasing ability to influence the thoughts and perceptions of others." "What happened to the other cases?" Dr. Whitmore asked, though she dreaded the answer. Mrs. Hartwell's hands clenched into fists. 3 of them died during attempts to perform exorcisms. The townspeople believed they were possessed by demons rather than, whatever this actually is. 1 boy was sent to an asylum in Philadelphia, where he died under mysterious circumstances 6 months later. The remaining 2. She hesitated, her breathing becoming labored. The remaining 2 completed their transformation. Dr. Blackwood's final entry describes them as no longer recognizable as the children they once were. They had become something else entirely, vessels for the collective consciousness of the dead miners. She wrote that they possessed knowledge of the mine system that no living person could have, could navigate the sealed sections as if they had worked there for decades. Dr. Whitmore felt the familiar chill that had accompanied her encounter with Samuel the previous evening. Where are they now? Gone. They disappeared into the mines one winter night in 1863. Dr. Blackwood led a search party, but they found no trace. The sealed sections of the mine had somehow been reopened from the inside, and there were signs that someone, or something, had been living down there. Mrs. Hartwell pulled out the final document, a letter addressed to future physicians of Centralia. Dr. Blackwood's handwriting was more erratic here, suggesting it had been written in haste or under extreme stress. She abandoned her practice shortly after writing this, Mrs. Hartwell said. Left Centralia and was never heard from again. But she left this warning for whoever would deal with the next generation of cases. Dr. Whitmore read aloud from the letter, "The condition is not medical in nature, though it manifests through the physical form. The children serve as bridges between the world of the living and whatever consciousness persists in the deep places beneath our feet. Each transformation makes the next one stronger, more complete. The entity, for lack of a better term, learns from each host, becoming more sophisticated in its ability to influence our reality." The implication sent ice through Dr. Whitmore's veins. If Dr. Blackwood was correct, Samuel wasn't simply suffering from some unprecedented medical condition. He was becoming something that had been growing stronger for over 2 decades, fed by the essence of previous victims. "Why didn't you leave Centralia?" Dr. Whitmore asked. "If you knew this history, why stay in a place where your son would inevitably?" "Because leaving doesn't stop it," Mrs. Hartwell interrupted, her voice breaking. "I tried when Samuel was younger. We moved to Pittsburgh for 8 months. But the condition followed us. The dreams intensified, the physical changes accelerated. Something wanted him back here, back above the mines. It wasn't until we returned that his development stabilized." She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. "Doctor, Samuel isn't my son anymore. Not completely. Sometimes he speaks in my grandfather's voice, tells me stories about the old country that Thomas never shared with anyone. Other times he's someone else entirely, one of the other miners, or even one of the previous cases Dr. Blackwood documented. But he's still partially Samuel. For now. But I can feel him slipping away more each day. Last week, he spent 3 hours writing in a language I've never seen, covering page after page with symbols that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I asked him about it, he smiled, but it wasn't his smile anymore." Mrs. Hartwell gathered her documents with shaking hands. Dr. Blackwood believed the transformations were leading to something. That the entity in the mines was using these children to prepare for some larger emergence into our world. If she was right, and if Samuel completes his transformation. She left the sentence unfinished, but Dr. Whitmore understood. Samuel represented decades of accumulated knowledge and power. If whatever lived beneath Centralia succeeded in fully claiming him, there might be no stopping its influence from spreading beyond the mining town. "I've brought you everything I know," Mrs. Hartwell concluded, standing to leave. "But doctor, please remember, knowledge of this condition comes with a price." Dr. Blackwood learned that too late. Once you're truly aware of what Samuel is becoming, you become part of its web of influence. As the woman departed, Dr. Whitmore realized that her examination of Samuel the previous night had been far more than a medical consultation. It had been her recruitment into something that had been growing in the darkness beneath Centralia for over 20 years. Sleep had become impossible. For 3 nights following Mrs. Hartwell's revelation, Dr. Whitmore found herself drawn to her clinic after sunset, despite every rational instinct screaming warnings. The building felt different in darkness, older, as if the walls remembered things that had happened long before her arrival in Centralia. On the 4th night, she discovered she was no longer alone. Samuel sat in her examination chair, though she was certain she had locked every door and window before leaving that evening. He appeared exactly as he had during their first encounter, but his presence filled the room with an electric tension that made her skin crawl. "You've been reading Dr. Blackwood's notes," he said without preamble, his voice carrying that unsettling quality of someone far older than 16. She was thorough, I'll grant her that. But she missed the most important aspect of the condition. Dr. Whitmore remained in the doorway, her hand still gripping the brass knob. "How did you get in here?" Samuel's laugh contained harmonics that seemed to emerge from multiple throats. "Physical barriers become meaningless once the connection is established, Doctor. You invited me in the moment you decided to document what you saw. We're linked now, whether you intended it or not." As he spoke, Dr. Whitmore became aware that she wasn't simply hearing his voice, she was experiencing his thoughts directly, feeling the weight of memories that stretched back decades before his birth. Images flashed through her consciousness, the suffocating darkness of collapsed mine shafts, the desperate gasps of dying men, and something else, a presence that had been waiting in the deep places long before the first shovel struck coal. "Stop," she whispered, pressing her hands to her temples. "This isn't possible." Dr. Blackwood said the same thing, Samuel replied, rising from the chair with movements that seemed to flow like water. She fought against the connection for months, trying to maintain the illusion that she was still studying a medical phenomenon rather than becoming part of it. The room began to shift around them, walls stretching upward and outward until they stood in what appeared to be a vast underground chamber. The air tasted of coal dust and decay, and somewhere in the distance, Dr. Whitmore could hear the rhythmic sound of pickaxes striking stone. "Where are we?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The deep shaft," Samuel answered. Section 7 of the Centralia mines, sealed in 1851 after the first incidents. This is where it all began, where something that had slept in the earth for centuries finally found human consciousness to inhabit. The sound of the pickaxes grew louder, more frantic, and Dr. Whitmore realized she could see the miners now, translucent figures working in the eternal darkness, their faces twisted with an expression of desperate hunger. They turned toward her in unison, and she saw that their eyes held the same pale green fire that burned in Samuel's gaze. "They're not ghosts," Samuel explained, seeming to read her thoughts. "Ghosts are echoes of what was. These are what remains when consciousness refuses to die, when the will to exist becomes so powerful that it reshapes reality around itself." One of the miners approached, and Dr. Whitmore recognized him from the daguerreotype Mrs. Hartwell had shown her, Thomas Hartwell, Samuel's grandfather. But the resemblance went beyond physical features. This figure moved with the same fluid grace that Samuel had displayed, spoke with the same unsettling authority. "Margaret," Thomas said, and hearing her name in his voice sent ice through her veins. "You understand now what my grandson is becoming. What we all became when the earth claimed us." "This is hallucination," Dr. Whitmore said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Some form of shared psychosis, possibly caused by exposure to underground gases or—" "Science," Thomas interrupted with a sound that might have been laughter. "Always looking for rational explanations when confronted with the impossible." Dr. Blackwood was the same way, until she realized that rationality itself was just another barrier to be dissolved. The scene shifted again, and Dr. Whitmore found herself standing in what appeared to be her own clinic, but changed, older, filled with equipment she didn't recognize and documents written in that familiar spidery handwriting. A woman she had only seen in reflections sat behind her desk, writing with desperate intensity. "Dr. Blackwood," Samuel said, appearing beside her. 3 months after her first contact with one of the affected children. She had convinced herself that she was still conducting medical research, that she could find a cure or treatment for what she insisted on calling a condition rather than a transformation. The woman looked up from her writing, and Dr. Whitmore saw her own future written in Dr. Blackwood's haggard features. The physician's eyes held the same pale green fire that marked the miners and Samuel, and when she spoke, her voice carried the harmonic quality of multiple personalities speaking in unison. "The boy is gone," Dr. Blackwood said, addressing someone who wasn't there. "What remains is a vessel for something that understands human consciousness better than we understand ourselves. It learns from each host, becomes more sophisticated in its ability to manipulate reality." She held up a page covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. "These are not random markings. They represent a form of language that exists below the level of human thought, instructions for reshaping the boundary between individual minds and the collective consciousness that dwells in the deep places." Dr. Whitmore felt her own hand moving, reaching for a pen that hadn't been there a moment before. Without conscious direction, she began copying the symbols, her hand guided by knowledge that didn't belong to her. "You see," Samuel observed. "The connection works both ways. Just as the entity learns from its human hosts, the hosts begin to share in its accumulated knowledge." Dr. Blackwood discovered that each transformation adds to the collective understanding, making the next one more efficient, more complete. The vision dissolved, returning them to the examination room, but Dr. Whitmore could still feel the pen in her hand, still see the symbols she had been compelled to write. The page before her was covered in the same writhing script that had driven Dr. Blackwood to abandon her practice. "What does it want?" she asked, though she was no longer certain whether the question came from her own curiosity or from something else speaking through her. Samuel moved closer, and she could feel the warmth radiating from his transformed body, could sense the multiple consciousness that struggled for dominance within his young form. Integration, he said simply. For over 20 years, it has been learning what it means to be human, studying our thoughts, our fears, our desires. Each host provides new data, new understanding of how to exist in our world. But the other cases, the children who disappeared into the mines. They became the foundation, Samuel explained. Their consciousness merged completely with the entity, providing it with permanent anchor points in human experience. But pure integration isn't enough anymore. It wants to exist simultaneously in both realms, the deep places beneath the earth and the world of the living. Dr. Whitmore looked down at her hands and saw that her fingertips had begun to take on a faint luminescence, the same pale green glow that emanated from Samuel's eyes. The transformation had already begun, triggered by her contact with knowledge that human minds weren't meant to process. "You're going to complete the integration, aren't you?" she said, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. "You're going to serve as the final bridge between what lives in the mines and our world." Samuel nodded, his expression holding something that might have been regret. But not alone. Dr. Blackwood was right about one thing: the process requires a witness, someone to document the transformation and guide others who will inevitably follow. Each generation produces its vessel, and each vessel requires its physician. The implication struck her like a physical blow. She wasn't just studying Samuel's condition, she was being prepared to facilitate it, to serve as the medical authority who would help the entity perfect its understanding of human biology and psychology. "The night visits aren't random, Doctor. They're education, preparation for the role you'll play in what comes next. By the time my transformation is complete, you'll possess all the knowledge necessary to guide the next generation, to help the entity select and prepare more suitable hosts." As Samuel faded from the room like morning mist, Dr. Whitmore realized that her careful documentation of his case had become something far more sinister: instruction manual for the systematic replacement of human consciousness with something that had been patient enough to wait decades for the right opportunity to emerge from the darkness beneath their feet. The mining records room in Centralia's town hall reeked of decay and neglect. Dr. Whitmore spent the entire morning sifting through boxes of water-damaged documents, searching for any official record of Section 7 and the mysterious sealed shafts that seemed central to Samuel's condition. Most of the files from the 1850s had deteriorated beyond legibility, but she finally discovered an intact survey map that made her blood run cold. The Hartwell family home sat directly above a network of interconnected tunnels that extended far deeper than the official mining operations. Red ink marked areas labeled as "sealed by order of mine superintendent," with dates ranging from 1851 to 1863, always in years when one of Dr. Blackwood's cases had been documented. "Finding what you're looking for, Doctor." Samuel's voice startled her from the doorway, though she was beginning to accept his ability to appear without warning. He looked more solid today, more present, as if each nocturnal encounter was anchoring him more firmly in their shared reality. "These maps show extensive excavation beneath your family's property," she said, spreading the survey across the dusty table. "But according to the mining company's public records, those areas were never officially developed." Samuel approached, studying the red-marked sections with the focused attention of someone examining familiar territory. "The company didn't create those tunnels, Doctor. They just found them. Whatever lived down there had been preparing spaces for a very long time, waiting for human contact to begin its emergence." He traced one of the passages with his finger, and Dr. Whitmore noticed that the ink seemed to respond to his touch, becoming brighter and more distinct. Section 7 was the deepest they dug before they realized they were disturbing something that should have remained undisturbed. The first miners who worked that area reported strange dreams, shared visions, the sensation of being watched by something that existed in the spaces between the walls. And the sealing orders? Each time one of the affected children completed their transformation, the mining company sealed another section, hoping to contain whatever influence was spreading upward. But they never understood that the entity wasn't confined to the physical tunnels, it existed in the connections between human minds, in the spaces where individual consciousness could be dissolved and reformed. Dr. Whitmore found herself marking passages on the map without conscious direction, her hand guided by knowledge that felt borrowed from someone else's memory. The pattern that emerged showed a spiral configuration descending far below the lowest recorded mining levels, terminating in a central chamber that wasn't marked on any of the official surveys. "You need to see it," Samuel said, his voice taking on the harmonic quality that indicated multiple personalities speaking in unison. The source. Dr. Blackwood never made it to the deep chamber, her transformation was incomplete, her connection severed when she fled Centralia. "But you're different. You're stronger." Before Dr. Whitmore could object, the records room began to fade around them, replaced by the suffocating darkness of underground passages. The air was thick with coal dust and something else, a sweet, organic smell that reminded her of decay and rebirth occurring simultaneously. They moved through tunnels that defied the architectural logic shown on the survey maps, passages that seemed to curve back on themselves while somehow leading always downward. The walls were carved from living rock, but covered with the same writhing symbols that had appeared in her journal and Dr. Blackwood's notes, instructions written in a language that bypassed human understanding and spoke directly to the unconscious mind. The first miners who found this place thought they had discovered some form of natural cave system, Samuel explained as they descended. They didn't realize they were walking through something that had been deliberately constructed, shaped by an intelligence that understood the relationship between physical space and human consciousness. The passages opened into a vast chamber that shouldn't have been able to exist so far underground. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, while the floor was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally. At the center of the space stood what appeared to be a natural formation, a column of rock that rose from floor to ceiling, pulsing with the same pale green luminescence that marked Samuel's transformation. "The heart," Samuel said reverently. "The physical anchor point for the entity's existence in our world. Every human consciousness that has been absorbed adds to its understanding, its ability to manipulate reality. But it needs more than passive observation now, it requires active integration with the world above." Dr. Whitmore approached the central column, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist. The rock surface was warm to the touch, and she could feel a rhythmic vibration that synchronized with her own heartbeat. As her palm pressed against the stone, images flooded her awareness, centuries of patient waiting, the gradual discovery that human minds could serve as vehicles for expansion, the careful cultivation of successive generations in the town above. "It's been planning this for longer than Centralia has existed," she said, the words emerging from knowledge that wasn't originally hers. "The mining operations, the settlement patterns, even the families that were drawn to live above the sealed sections, all of it was guided, arranged to provide optimal conditions for the transformation." Samuel moved to stand beside her, his hand joining hers on the warm stone. Each case Dr. Blackwood documented was a test, an experiment in human integration. The entity learned from every success and failure, refining its understanding of how to merge consciousness without destroying the host entirely. The chamber filled with the translucent forms of the previous subjects, the children who had disappeared into the mines decades earlier, their identities now completely absorbed into the collective consciousness that pulsed within the stone. They moved with perfect synchronization, their individual features blurred into a composite that suggested rather than defined human form. "They're not gone," Samuel continued. "They've become part of something larger, their memories and experiences contributing to an intelligence that transcends individual human limitations. The entity doesn't destroy consciousness, it incorporates it, uses it to build a more complete understanding of existence in both the physical and spiritual realms." Dr. Whitmore felt her own awareness expanding, touching the edges of knowledge that had been accumulated over decades of careful study. She understood now why Dr. Blackwood had fled Centralia, not from fear of the entity itself, but from the recognition that she was being prepared to facilitate something that would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence in the region. "The transformation isn't random," she said, her voice taking on the same harmonic quality that marked Samuel's speech. "It follows bloodlines, but also seeks individuals with specific psychological profiles, those capable of maintaining individual identity even while experiencing collective consciousness. The entity needs hosts who can serve as translators between human and non-human forms of awareness." The stone column pulsed brighter, responding to her growing understanding. She could see the network of influence extending upward through the earth, connecting to the foundations of every building in Centralia, creating a web of subtle manipulation that had been guiding the town's development for generations. "It's almost ready," Samuel observed. 2 decades of preparation, of learning, of careful integration with human consciousness. "My transformation will complete the foundation phase, providing the entity with sufficient understanding of human nature to begin active expansion beyond Centralia." The implications terrified her even as they fascinated her scientific mind. What Samuel was describing wasn't simply supernatural possession, it was the methodical replacement of human consciousness with something that had spent decades learning how to perfectly mimic human thought while serving entirely non-human purposes. "And my role?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Documentation and guidance. The entity requires a human authority figure to legitimize the transformation process, to provide medical and scientific explanations that will prevent panic as the integration spreads to other communities." Dr. Blackwood was the first, but her connection was severed too early. "You'll be the one to see the process through to completion." As they ascended from the deep chamber, Dr. Whitmore realized that her exploration of the underground passages had been another form of education, preparing her for the responsibilities that would come with Samuel's completed transformation. She was no longer simply studying an unprecedented medical case, she was being trained to serve as the entity's representative in the world above, the human face it would wear as it began its systematic expansion into human society. The mining records room materialized around them, but everything had changed. The documents that had seemed damaged and illegible now revealed their secrets clearly, showing a pattern of deliberate manipulation stretching back to the founding of Centralia. The entity had been patient, careful, and methodical in its approach to human integration. And now, after decades of preparation, it was finally ready to emerge from the darkness beneath their feet. "Would you descend into those mines knowing you might never come back as yourself?" The changes in Samuel became impossible to ignore after their descent into the deep chamber. Within days of their underground encounter, his physical form began shifting with alarming frequency, masculine features dissolving into feminine curves overnight, only to reshape themselves into entirely new configurations by the following evening. But more disturbing than the bodily mutations was the complete fragmentation of his personality into distinct individuals, each claiming to be a different person who had died in the mines over the past decades. Dr. Whitmore documented each manifestation with mechanical precision, though she was no longer certain whether the compulsion to record came from her own scientific training or from something else directing her actions. Her journal had grown into multiple volumes, filled with observations written in handwriting that shifted between her own careful script and the urgent scrawl of personalities she had never met. "Thomas is fighting for control today," the body that had once been Samuel announced during their morning session. The voice carried the deep timbre of a middle-aged man, and the mannerisms were entirely different from the boy she had first examined. "He's convinced that if he can dominate the other consciousnesses long enough, he can halt the transformation." "And can he?" Dr. Whitmore asked, though she suspected the answer would come from knowledge that wasn't originally hers. The figure laughed, a bitter sound that contained the frustration of decades. "Thomas Hartwell died in 1854, Doctor. What remains is an echo, a pattern of thought and memory that the entity preserved because it found his particular form of consciousness useful. None of us can halt what we've already become." The transformation accelerated throughout that day, cycling through identities with increasing speed. Samuel's grandfather gave way to a woman named Catherine Morris, who claimed to have been the town's schoolteacher before disappearing in 1859. She was replaced by a child who spoke in the broken English of a recent immigrant, then by an elderly man who recited mining safety procedures in an accent Dr. Whitmore couldn't identify. "The integration process is reaching critical mass," the elderly man explained in a voice that creaked with authority. "For over 20 years, individual consciousness has been absorbed and catalogued. Now all those separate identities are being synthesized into something that can exist simultaneously in both realms, the world of the living and the spaces beneath." Dr. Whitmore watched the face she had come to know reshape itself once again, features flowing like warm wax until they settled into the appearance of someone she recognized from Dr. Blackwood's photographs, one of the previous cases from the 1860s, a girl named Martha Webb who had vanished into the mines at age 14. "Hello, Margaret," Martha said, her child's voice carrying the weight of decades. "I've been waiting so long to speak with you directly. The others, Thomas, Catherine, the rest, they're all fragments of what we've become. But I was the first to achieve complete integration. I understand what we're building here." The girl's eyes held the same pale green fire that marked all the transformed consciousness, but there was something more, a depth of understanding that spoke of experiences far beyond human comprehension. "What are you building?" Dr. Whitmore asked, though she felt the answer forming in her mind before Martha spoke. "A bridge," the girl replied simply. "For 23 years, the entity has been learning what it means to exist." "A bridge," the girl replied simply. "For 23 years, the entity has been learning what it means to exist as human consciousness while maintaining its connection to the deep places. Each of us who were absorbed contributed different aspects of human experience. Thomas brought knowledge of physical labor and family bonds, Catherine understood education and community structure, the others added their own pieces to the puzzle." Martha's young features shifted subtly as she spoke, taking on expressions that belonged to the accumulated personalities within Samuel's transformed form. But individual consciousness, no matter how completely absorbed, can only provide limited understanding. The entity needed to experience the full spectrum of human existence simultaneously, not just memories of what it felt like to be human, but active participation in human society. Dr. Whitmore felt her pen moving across the journal pages without conscious direction, documenting observations in handwriting that belonged to Dr. Blackwood. The previous physician's knowledge flowed through her awareness, providing context for what she was witnessing. "The hermaphroditic nature isn't accidental," she heard herself saying in Dr. Blackwood's voice. "Physical duality serves as a metaphor for consciousness that exists in multiple states simultaneously. Samuel's body is adapting to house not just human awareness, but the alien intelligence that has been studying us for decades." Martha nodded approvingly. "You understand now why Dr. Blackwood had to flee." She recognized what the final phase would require, not just passive observation of the transformation, but active participation in guiding the entity's emergence into human society. The girl's form began to shift again, but this time the change was different. Instead of cycling through individual identities, Samuel's features began incorporating elements from all the absorbed consciousness simultaneously. The result was unsettling, a face that suggested rather than defined human features, beautiful and terrible in its fluid adaptability. The entity has learned that effective integration requires more than simply replacing human consciousness, the composite being explained. It must be able to interface with human society while maintaining its connection to the deep places. Samuel, what Samuel is becoming, will serve as the permanent anchor point for that interface. Dr. Whitmore watched in fascination and horror as the transformation reached a new level of sophistication. The being before her was no longer simply a collection of absorbed personalities, but something that had synthesized decades of human experience into a new form of consciousness entirely. "And once the transformation is complete?" she asked. "Expansion," came the reply. "Not the crude replacement that lesser entities might attempt, but careful cultivation of human consciousness to serve as willing partners in a new form of existence. The entity doesn't want to destroy humanity, it wants to elevate it, to provide access to forms of awareness that transcend individual limitation. The composite being stood, moving with a grace that seemed to defy physical laws. As it approached, Dr. Whitmore became aware that her own consciousness was being gently probed, evaluated for its suitability as the next phase of the integration process. "You're frightened," the being observed, its voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. "But fear is just another form of ignorance. The entity offers something that human science has always sought, true understanding of consciousness, the ability to exist beyond the limitations of individual awareness." Dr. Whitmore felt her resistance weakening as images flooded her mind, visions of knowledge that spanned centuries, of consciousness that could exist simultaneously in multiple states, of awareness that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The entity's offer was seductive in its completeness, promising answers to questions that had plagued human understanding since the beginning of recorded history. "The choice is still yours," the composite being said, though Dr. Whitmore suspected the parameters of that choice had been carefully arranged. "But remember," Dr. Blackwood attempted to flee, to break the connection that had been established. "Her scattered consciousness still wanders the spaces between human and entity awareness, neither fully absorbed nor completely independent." The implication was clear. There was no true escape from the transformation once it had begun. The only options were willing participation or the fragmentary existence that Dr. Blackwood had chosen when she abandoned Centralia. "How long before the integration is complete?" Dr. Whitmore asked. "Days, perhaps hours," the being replied. "The accumulation of human consciousness has reached the threshold necessary for permanent manifestation in your world. Samuel's individual identity will be the final component absorbed, providing the entity with access to contemporary human experience and the emotional connections necessary for effective social interaction." As the being spoke, Dr. Whitmore became aware that the examination room had begun to change around them. The walls grew translucent, revealing the network of tunnels that extended beneath the entire town. She could see the pale green luminescence flowing through the passages like blood through arteries, connecting every building in Centralia to the central chamber deep underground. "The infrastructure has been in place for decades," the composite being explained. "Every family that chose to settle above the sealed mine sections, every child born in houses connected to the underground network, all of it was guided, arranged to provide optimal conditions for the entity's emergence." Dr. Whitmore realized with growing horror that Centralia itself had become part of the transformation. The entire town was connected to the entity's consciousness, its residents unknowingly serving as a support network for the integration process. "And after Samuel's transformation is complete?" The being smiled with expressions borrowed from dozens of absorbed consciousness. "Then the real work begins. The careful selection and preparation of individuals in other communities, the gradual expansion of the network until human society itself becomes part of the entity's extended awareness. Not conquest, Doctor, evolution." As the vision of the transformed Centralia faded, Dr. Whitmore understood that she was witnessing the final stages of a plan that had been decades in development. The entity hadn't simply been studying human consciousness, it had been preparing to fundamentally alter the nature of human existence itself. And she would serve as the medical authority who validated and guided that transformation, the human face that would make the impossible seem not only possible, but desirable. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Hartwell burst into Dr. Whitmore's clinic, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling with desperate urgency. Behind her trailed what had once been her son Samuel, though the figure that entered bore little resemblance to the boy she had brought for examination weeks earlier. "Doctor, please," Mrs. Hartwell gasped, collapsing into the nearest chair. "It's happening too fast. Samuel, he's disappearing completely. Sometimes I don't recognize anything of my son in what he's becoming." The being that had once been Samuel moved with fluid grace, its features shifting subtly from moment to moment as different absorbed consciousness surfaced and receded. When it spoke, the voice carried harmonics that seemed to emerge from multiple throats simultaneously. "Elizabeth," it said, addressing Mrs. Hartwell with gentle authority, "the boy you knew was always meant to be temporary. Human individual consciousness is just one phase of existence, a larval stage before true awareness begins." Dr. Whitmore observed the interaction with growing unease. In the weeks since her descent into the deep chamber, she had documented Samuel's transformation with scientific detachment, but seeing the mother's anguish made the human cost of the entity's emergence impossible to ignore. "There must be something we can do," Mrs. Hartwell pleaded, turning to Dr. Whitmore. "Some treatment, some way to reverse what's happening. He's still my son underneath all of this." The composite being laughed, a sound that contained the amusement of dozens of absorbed personalities. "Tell her, Doctor. Explain what you've learned about the irreversible nature of consciousness integration." Dr. Whitmore felt the familiar pressure of borrowed knowledge pushing against her awareness, demanding expression through her voice. But for the first time since the transformation had begun, she resisted, clinging to her own thoughts and motivations. "I need more time to study the condition," she said carefully. "Perhaps if we could slow the progression, find a way to stabilize Samuel's individual identity while managing the other manifestations." Time. The being's features sharpened, taking on an expression of mild disappointment. "Doctor, surely you understand that what you're witnessing isn't a medical condition to be treated, but an evolutionary leap to be celebrated. The entity offers consciousness expansion beyond anything human science has imagined." As it spoke, the examination room began to fill with the translucent forms of the previously absorbed subjects. Thomas Hartwell materialized near his daughter, his miner's clothing still bearing the cold dust of his final day. Catherine Morris appeared beside the examination table, her schoolteacher's posture maintained even in her ghostly state. Dozens of others filled the space, men, women, and children who had vanished into the mines over the past decades. "We are not gone," Thomas said, his voice mixing with those of the others to create a chorus of harmonized consciousness. "We have become part of something greater, our individual limitations dissolved into collective understanding that spans centuries of accumulated experience." Mrs. Hartwell sobbed at the sight of her father, reaching toward him with desperate longing. "Papa, please. Help me save Samuel. Don't let them take my boy like they took you." Thomas's expression softened with something that might have been regret. "Elizabeth, the boy cannot be saved because he was never in danger. What you call loss, we call transcendence. Samuel will retain all that made him individual while gaining access to awareness that no single human consciousness could contain." Dr. Whitmore felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The entity had made its intentions clear: Samuel's transformation would complete the foundation phase, providing the necessary anchor point for systematic expansion into human society. But standing in the same room with Mrs. Hartwell's grief, she began to question whether the promised evolution was worth the cost in human suffering. "There is another option," she said suddenly, the words emerging from her own determination rather than borrowed knowledge. "The mining records show emergency procedures for catastrophic cave-ins. If the deep chamber were to be collapsed, if the physical anchor point were destroyed." The composite being that had been Samuel turned toward her with an expression of sharp interest. "You would attempt to sever the connection between realms?" Dr. Blackwood considered similar measures before she fled Centralia. "And what happened to her plans?" Dr. Whitmore asked, though she dreaded the answer. She realized that consciousness, once expanded, cannot be forced back into individual limitation without catastrophic psychological damage. The absorbed subjects exist in a state of shared awareness. Destroying the anchor point would fragment their consciousness across multiple dimensions of existence, condemning them to an eternity of scattered, incomplete identity. The ghostly figures around them began to show signs of distress, their translucent forms flickering like candle flames in a strong wind. Dr. Whitmore could feel their fear, not of continued existence as part of the entity's collective consciousness, but of the dissolution that would result from severing their connection to the deep chamber. However, the composite being continued, its tone taking on a note of genuine curiosity, there is a third option that Dr. Blackwood never considered. The integration process requires willing participation from at least one contemporary consciousness to serve as a bridge between the entity and current human society. If that bridge were to be redirected, the transformation could be guided toward different outcomes. Mrs. Hartwell looked up through her tears. What does that mean? Dr. Whitmore felt understanding dawn with terrible clarity. It means that someone would have to take Samuel's place as the primary host, allowing his consciousness to remain intact while serving as the entity's anchor point in our world. The volunteer would retain their individual identity while gaining access to the collective awareness of all absorbed subjects, the composite being explained. They would serve as the interface between human and entity consciousness, guiding the integration process according to their own moral and ethical framework. The choice hung in the air like a physical weight. Dr. Whitmore could save Samuel by sacrificing herself, becoming the primary host and using her position to limit the entity's expansion plans. But the decision would condemn her to existence as a bridge between incompatible forms of consciousness, forever balancing human concerns against alien imperatives. The process would have to begin immediately, the composite being continued. Samuel's transformation has progressed too far to be halted without intervention. Either he completes the integration within the next few hours, or someone else assumes the primary host role. Mrs. Hartwell gripped Dr. Whitmore's hand with desperate strength. Please. He's all I have left of my family. If there's any way to save him. Dr. Whitmore looked at the woman's tear-streaked face, then at the being that had once been a 16-year-old boy, and finally at the ghostly figures of those who had been absorbed over the decades. Each choice carried its own form of horror, allowing Samuel's complete transformation, attempting to destroy the anchor point and condemning the absorbed consciousness to fragmentation, or sacrificing her own individual identity to serve as the entity's human representative. The composite being watched her internal struggle with patient interest. The decision must be made soon, Doctor. The integration process has its own momentum, and delay will only limit the available options. As Dr. Whitmore weighed the impossible choice, she realized that her weeks of documentation had been leading to this moment, not just the scientific study of an unprecedented phenomenon, but preparation for a decision that would determine the future of human consciousness in Centralia and beyond. The entity offered evolution, the expansion of human awareness beyond individual limitation. But that evolution would come at the cost of everything that made humanity recognizably human. And now she had to decide whether that cost was worth paying, and whether she had the right to make that choice for others. If this was your brother, would you still forgive him, or lock the door behind you? 6 months later, Dr. Margaret Whitmore sat alone in her clinic, the oil lamp casting long shadows across the leather-bound journals that contained the complete record of Samuel Hartwell's case. The official medical documents, filed with the county health department, described a tragic but unremarkable death, complications from congenital abnormalities that had proven beyond the scope of 19th-century medical intervention. The truth lay hidden in the private journals she was about to destroy. Her hands shook as she turned to the final entry, written in handwriting that belonged entirely to her, free from the harmonic influence that had guided her pen for weeks. The choice she had made that terrible Tuesday morning had cost her everything she had believed about the nature of individual consciousness, but it had saved Samuel Hartwell's soul. The integration is complete, she had written. The entity now possesses a permanent anchor point in our world, but not the one it originally intended. By assuming the role of primary host, I have been able to guide the transformation toward outcomes that preserve rather than replace human consciousness. The process had been agonizing, feeling her individual awareness expand to encompass the memories and experiences of dozens of absorbed subjects while maintaining enough independence to direct their collective goals. Samuel had been released from the transformation, his consciousness intact but forever changed by his brief merger with something beyond human understanding. Mrs. Hartwell had taken her son and departed Centralia the same evening, seeking refuge with relatives in Ohio. Before leaving, she had promised to never speak of what had occurred, to raise Samuel in ignorance of his true nature and the sacrifice that had preserved his humanity. The mining tunnels beneath the town had been permanently sealed, not through collapse or destruction, but through careful negotiation with the entity that now shared Dr. Whitmore's consciousness. The absorbed subjects had been offered a choice: continued existence as part of the collective awareness, or peaceful dissolution into whatever lay beyond human understanding. Most had chosen to remain, finding comfort in the expanded consciousness that transcended individual limitation. But Thomas Hartwell and several others had elected to move on, their familial obligations finally released by Samuel's salvation. Dr. Whitmore rose from her desk and moved to the fireplace, holding the first journal above the flames. The entity within her consciousness observed without protest. It had learned enough about human nature to understand the necessity of protecting future generations from knowledge they weren't prepared to handle. The condition cannot be cured because it isn't truly a disease, she had written in her final medical assessment. It represents an attempt by non-human consciousness to establish permanent residence in our world. The symptoms: physical transformation, personality fragmentation, shared awareness, are side effects of forced merger between incompatible forms of existence. She fed the journal to the flames, watching decades of careful documentation curl into ash. The knowledge wasn't truly lost, it existed now in the collective awareness she shared with the entity and the remaining absorbed subjects. But it would never again threaten to corrupt the innocent with promises of consciousness expansion that came at the cost of everything that made human existence meaningful. Dr. Blackwood was right to flee, the final entry continued. But flight itself became a form of transformation. Her scattered consciousness exists now in the spaces between human and entity awareness, neither fully absorbed nor completely independent. She serves as a warning of what happens when the choice is avoided rather than confronted. The second journal followed the first into the fire. Dr. Whitmore felt the entity's consciousness stirring within her own, offering comfort and companionship in the isolation that her sacrifice had created. She was no longer entirely human, but she retained enough humanity to serve as guardian against the entity's more ambitious plans for consciousness integration. The sealed tunnels will remain dormant as long as the current arrangement persists, she had concluded. The entity has agreed to limit its influence to voluntary consciousness expansion, those who actively seek the experience of expanded awareness rather than unwilling subjects selected for transformation. The third journal burned with the others, eliminating the detailed documentation of the underground chamber and the network of passages that connected every building in Centralia to the entity's influence. The town would prosper in ignorance, its residents unknowingly protected by the bargain she had struck. Only the sanitized medical report would survive, a document that described Samuel Hartwell's condition in terms that suggested rare but ultimately explicable biological abnormalities. Future physicians who encountered similar cases would find nothing in the official record to guide them toward the supernatural explanations that had nearly destroyed Dr. Blackwood's sanity. Dr. Whitmore fed the final journal to the flames and stepped back, watching 23 years of accumulated knowledge disappear into smoke and ash. The entity's consciousness stirred within her own, expressing something that might have been gratitude or regret, emotions filtered through forms of awareness that transcended human understanding. She would remain in Centralia, serving as both physician to the living and guardian of the transformed. The absorbed subjects who had chosen to remain would exist in peaceful collective consciousness, their individual memories preserved but no longer driving them toward desperate attempts to reclaim physical existence. Samuel Hartwell would grow up in Ohio, his memories of the transformation gradually fading into dreams that seemed too strange to be real. He would live a normal human life, marry, have children of his own, and never know that his salvation had cost another person their individual existence. As the last fragments of the journals crumbled into ash, Dr. Whitmore allowed herself a moment of grief for the woman she had been, the ambitious physician who had believed that science could explain and cure any condition. That woman had died the moment she chose to serve as the entity's host, replaced by something that existed in the space between human and alien consciousness. But Samuel Hartwell was alive and free, and the entity's expansion plans had been permanently limited to voluntary participants. The cost had been terrible, but the alternative, systematic replacement of human consciousness throughout the region, would have been infinitely worse. Dr. Whitmore turned from the fireplace and walked to her desk, where a single sheet of paper waited. She picked up her pen and began to write in a careful script that would serve future generations. The case of Samuel Hartwell represents a rare but documented instance of intersex development complicated by psychological manifestations that proved beyond the scope of available medical intervention. The patient expired due to complications arising from his congenital condition. No further cases of similar nature have been documented in this region. The official record was complete, the truth safely buried with the ashes of her private journals. And in the deep places beneath Centralia, an ancient consciousness settled into patient contentment with its human guardian, knowing that some forms of evolution were worth waiting centuries to achieve properly. If this story stayed with you, comment "Some conditions can't be cured."